All right, here we go. All right. All right, welcome everybody tonight. I am excited for this discussion. I had a list of guests I want to get on at some point, and ever since I don't know, we met maybe a couple years ago.
Yeah.
It was a private discussion with Hugh Ross speaking, of all people. um, But this one thing. A lot of times, and actually, I was giving a talk at a youth ministry maybe last week, no, 2 weeks ago, and one of there's three kind of workshops that I offer, and one is Can I Trust the Bible? But within that talk, I address some of the archaeological evidence because I think it's so um, profound and hard to get away from. And I know when you and I were kind of talking, and we'll get into your background in a minute. But one of the great things about the field of archaeology to me, as far as apologetics is concerned, is that it's tangible, it's objective. It's hard when something is discovered to deny its existence. Some may disagree with the cosmological or teleological arguments, but something that you can actually touch is very hard to contradict the existence of. And so I think that's a great jump off. Maybe first, can you introduce yourself? Tell us what you do, and how this is pertinent tonight.
Sure. Great to be with you, Alex. Ted Wright, and I'm the founder and executive director of epicarchaeology.org. And I've been involved in apologetics for probably about 15 or 16 years. And I've taught seminary before. And I started Epic Archaeology about 3 years ago, primarily because there's really not a lot of good archaeological evidences from an apologetic standpoint out there. I know a lot of apologists talk about it, but I wanted to bring my area of expertise in archaeology into the apologetics community so that people could have one source that they could go to find archaeological evidence for the Bible.
Gotcha. So, what got you involved in archaeology? Like, what was your major? Did you have that as a field going into college, or did you get into it later?
No, actually, I served in the United States Air Force for 4 years, and I was getting ready to get out of the Air Force. And my plan was to actually get a degree in ancient history, and so I thought, that's pretty cool. And one night, just sort of was still sort of hadn't really landed. I was going to do ancient history, and so I was going to a pretty good church at the time, and was very good friends with the senior pastor. So one Sunday night, I asked him. I said, "Can I meet with you in your office? Just pray with me. I'm getting ready to get out, go back into the civilian world and get my degree in ancient history. But I'm still not exactly sure if that's what I should be doing." So he said, "Ted, I have just the thing I want to give you." So I met him in his office, and he gave me this big stack of magazines, and it was Biblical Archaeology Review magazine, and uh, and so I took him home, and it took like about probably 2 hours, and I thought, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to do archaeology.
Wow.
And that's sort of, the rest is history. And that's really what got me into it. And then what really got me to apologetics was actually getting my degree in archaeology. Because I actually faced a lot of my professors were unbelievers, or at least they had a very low view of the scripture. And so they were telling me that some of the stories that I was reading in the Bible were actually not true historically. But as a Christian, I knew that there's something not quite right with that. And so that led me to looking at the connection between archaeology and ancient history and what we read in the biblical text.
Gotcha. That's it's really interesting because we don't. One of the things that I talk about a lot and write about a lot outside of apologetics is purpose, and basically part of it is being able to connect the dots to figure out where your purpose ultimately lies, because that's where you're going to find the fulfillment. And just think if you had gone to the history route, not that that's bad,
Yeah.
but I know how much joy you get out of this.
I do. Yeah.
So I'm glad you had that advice.
And it's funny because when I was teaching seminary, a lot of my students would ask me after class during the course of the semester, they would say, "Professor Wright, I love your passion, but I don't know what I should be doing." And so what I tell them is I tell them, do what you're passionate about. I mean, where there's a need and where you have a passion and where God's gifted you, that's probably where you should serve. So And I look back on the many years that I studied archaeology, and I got to say, Alex, that my interest in archaeology has only increased; it hasn't decreased. And because what I thought I knew 10 years ago, I didn't know what I didn't know. And now that I've grown in my understanding, and now I realize how ignorant I am of this area, and how vast of an area it is, and how so few Christians really understand the amazing time that we live in history. The fact that we do have archaeological evidence for the majority of the scripture, and so it's just an amazing time to be alive.
So it's interesting how you alluded to that. So and you kind of touched on it already, but how does archaeology work in relationship to apologetics? I know you already touched on this, but almost like, what would you say to other apologists who don't really tap into this area? Not that they all have to become archaeologists, but understanding how much benefit it could add to their apologetic ministry, even if they understood a little bit more depth, in archaeology.
Exactly. That's a great question, Alex. And I would say that for I guess here, I'm trying to think of how the best way to answer that question, but yes, you're right. Most apologists don't have to become archaeologists in order to use archaeology in their case. So let me begin with the overarching question, and that is the relationship between archaeology and Christian apologetics. And as you and I both know, because I think you went to Cross-Examine Instructor Academy with Frank Turek, and I used to work with Frank several years ago at Cross-Examine, and Frank and I both went to SES in Charlotte. So we were both trained in the classical method of apologetics, which basically says that it actually starts out by basically saying that we first have to establish God's existence. So theism has to be true, truth has to be there, and then miracles have to be possible in order for Christianity to be true. And then the New Testament has to be reliable. So the very essence of the Christian faith relies on the resurrection of Jesus, the historical bodily resurrection of Jesus. And where we learn about that is in the pages of the New Testament. And so this is where archaeology can come in and to bring in support for the reliability of the New Testament. Now, it's not just archaeology, but we also have manuscript evidence as well. We have internal evidence in the text itself. In Frank's book with Dr. Geisler, I don't have faith to be an atheist. They talk about, certain points of that things just wouldn't make sense apart from Jesus being risen from the dead, such as embarrassing testimony and things like that the New Testament writers use. So what I would say from a very broad brush stroke on this question is that archaeology it doesn't make the case for Christianity, but it is a key part of our overall apologetic. And so overall apologetic of the resurrection. But then broadly speaking, it also provides support for the historical reliability of not just the New Testament, but also the Old Testament as well.
We're gonna definitely get into the Old Testament because obviously that's a farther distance in time from where we are now.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna say this first part, and everybody listening, don't quote me on it, but I've heard that there have been something in the range of 20,000+ archaeological digs pertaining to or based on the Bible with no disagreements. Now, even if that's not the exact number, that's not really the point. But what I would ask is, what does that amount of archaeological digs tell us about the accuracy of the biblical documents themselves? And I know you were touching on just how long archaeology has been around in the first place, which I didn't realize, and maybe you can touch on that too.
Yeah. Archaeology is, for us, it seems like a long time, like 120 years or so. It seems like a long time, and it is, because if you live to be 120, that's a long time. But from a scientific standpoint, from a historical standpoint, it's really not that long. And archaeology has only been around for at least since the 1890s. It got started back in around 1892. Somewhere in that time frame, by a British archaeologist by the name of William Matthew Flinders Petrie, who utilized scientific excavation methods at a site in Israel called Tel El Hesi. So what I would say is, and I've never heard that number before. It could be accurate, but I just don't know. I've never heard anybody put a number on it. It's really hard to say exactly how many archaeological digs are, because I will say this, that many of the archaeological discoveries that ends up showing the reliability of the Bible were discovered by people really not setting out to prove the Bible or anything like that. I can give you multiple examples of that, but the point is, and I'll share maybe perhaps a helpful analogy that might help here to help people understand the power of archaeology in making the case for Christianity. I heard it put this way, and this is not original myself. I heard this from another archaeologist that I respect. And he said it's this way. So if anybody out there has ever worked at a factory, and you work quality control and you're making a widget in a factory, let's say you got to make 500 widgets a day, and you got to put the widgets in the box, and you got to make sure that all the widgets are working correctly. Well, you can't check every single solitary widget that you make, but you take a sampling and you test those samples to see if they work. Well, so archaeology is the same way. We have not looked at every single solitary site in Israel. We haven't looked at every location, but wherever we have looked and wherever archaeology has put a shovel in the ground, we actually have historical and archaeological support for the text. Now, that doesn't mean every discovery relates to the Bible, but when the time is right and when the site is correct, then more often than not, the discovery ends up showing the reliability and the accuracy of the historical text. And if you don't mind, Alex, I'll share one big example. So back in 1906 in Turkey, there was a German archaeologist working in Turkey. And now think about the time frame, 1906. Now that date might not be significant, but in 1859, just about 60 or 70 years before that, there was a very important book published in Germany by a German scholar by the name of Julius Valhausen. And Valhausen was an Old Testament scholar. And excuse me, I'm jumping ahead. 1877 was Valhausen's book. 1859 was Darwin on the Origin of Species. So we got Darwin, and then in 1877, you've got Valhausen. And so what this means is that by the time you have the turn of the century in the early 1900s, in Europe and many places in America, people had a very skeptical view of the historical reliability of the Bible. So in 1906, there was a German archaeologist working in Turkey, and he was actually working on the site based on previous surveys done by two French scholars, and he ends up discovering the entire Hittite Empire. Now, the only place where the Hittites were mentioned was the Old Testament at that time. Now, we now know that the Hittites are mentioned in Egyptian text, but hieroglyphics wasn't deciphered until 1820 with Champollion. So the only other place that the Hittites are mentioned was the Old Testament. And here we have an archaeologist, a German archaeologist in Turkey, who discovers the entire Hittite library and archive of 10,000 clay tablets. The capital was called Hattusha, and it's in modern day Turkey. So right out of the gate, archaeology is starting to prove the Bible just as it gets started.
Wow, that's pretty.
And that's we could be for hours. There's so many,
Well, I mean, let's maybe do one more, because one of the things I think is interesting that I've heard, and you can kind of go deeper on this, is that a lot of atheistic archaeologists or scholars will use the biblical documents as primary source documents to know where to go look, even if they don't affirm the gospel or the things in the text, but at least they affirm the accuracy of what the text records, which, I think it should take you another step further. But even if it doesn't, that does amazing work to promote the validity of the Bible itself. So maybe like one more example about an atheistic discovery that they may not even be pleased that they discovered it.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll tell you one example that comes to mind. There's so many that come to mind. One, it was a very glaring example that really undercut the main argument. So it takes a little bit of setup to explain sort of the significance of this discovery. So in Old Testament scholarship, there's a school of biblical interpretation, a biblical scholarship called the Copenhagen School of Biblical Interpretation. And it gets its name by two Danish scholars, Thomas Thompson and Niels Peter Lemke, who are professors of Old Testament in Copenhagen, Denmark. So and that's not just those two guys, but there are other scholars as well who follow this Copenhagen school. It goes by the name of biblical minimalism. Some people may have heard of that, but essentially what biblical minimalism, the theory is that the Old Testament has zero historical value whatsoever. The only source that we can understand the Old Testament is archaeology. We have to throw out anything the Old Testament says, and whatever archaeology, we can't use it as a historical source. So what they do is they actually denied that King David ever existed. Well, in 1991, an archaeologist working in northern Israel, an Israeli archaeologist, and to my knowledge, I don't know if he was a believer or not. He definitely wasn't a Christian, maybe a Jew, possibly, but he could have been atheistic or agnostic. His name is Abraham Baram, and he excavated in the site in northern Israel called Tel Dan, and they discovered this stele that actually contains the name of David on the stele. And so this archaeological discovery actually undercut this whole theory. And so now they really can't, I don't know how they responded to that, but they now have to admit that David did exist. Right. And he is situated very firmly in history.
Yeah, and we're going to get more into David in a second, because that's obviously key, and even pertaining to the gospel, because even the lineage of Jesus, the natural lineage that is connected to David, and so that's not a small thing. There was, I believe, Rank in his book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, wrote this, or maybe I heard it from him. But just in the last 16 chapters of Acts, there are 84 facts that have been confirmed by historical and archaeological research, and maybe you even helped him figure that out.
Now that's actually I got the book right here. This is the book it's based on. It's called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. Okay. And Dr. Geisler taught both Frank and myself about this book. I didn't know about it, but Colin Hemer he's passed away now. He's deceased, but if you, Alex, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this guy, but Sir William Ramsay was a very famous classical scholar back in the 19th century, and he was not necessarily a religious guy, but he began to study the Book of Acts and Paul's letters, and discovered that they actually contain an enormous amount of accurate historical information about the Greco-Roman world. So they served as a great source. So Ramsay was this great proponent of the reliability of the epistles of Paul, and of course the Book of Acts. And then this book came along. This is like the most modern version of William Ramsay, and it's the book is called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History by Colin Hemer. It's spelled Hemer. And Geisler told us about this book, and so they incorporated Geisler and Turek incorporated a lot of this material in this book by Colin Hemer into their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And so there are, even since the book came out, there have been discoveries that have actually shown that Colin Hemer was right. So let me give you a little background. So if Luke, the gospel writer who wrote the Gospel of Luke, he also wrote the Book of Acts. We believe he wrote Luke and Acts. Right. And he, of course, in the Gospel of Luke, he's writing about Jesus. And so if we can go into Greco-Roman history to see if some of the things he writes about, now he's claiming to be an eyewitness. He claims to be someone who actually traveled with the Apostle Paul. Yeah. And so if we can actually go and do the research, and this is exactly what Colin Hemer did, he went and did the research and discovered that there are detailed eyewitness geographical points of location. For instance, one of them is like the depth of the sea off the coast of Malta, the prevailing winds off of this island, that are still 2,000 years, later are still exactly the same. So very detailed information that only an eyewitness would know, which means that Luke is writing accurate historical information. If we can trust him with the Book of Acts, we can consequently trust him with the Book of Luke as well.
And even to go deeper, at least for me, what was, because this is one of the main things about archaeology that I bring up when I do go speak, because I'm obviously not an archaeologist, but this is the part that I think is accessible, especially when I speak to youth, that in Acts 13:13, the proper port name in, I think it's Perga. Yeah. It's there's a conspicuous sailor's landmark in Acts 16:11 that, obviously they're seafaring people. They have to know, how to navigate so they don't crash. Arapagites as a proper terminology, I think in Acts 18. But it's not just that these are accurate or confirmed historically or archaeologically. It's also that, and we know how you and I talk when we were kids, the slang that we use is not the slang of today.
That's right.
What people call things, even if it's the same location, a store being there today, they won't necessarily be there in 10 years. So somebody can say, did you go to the I grew up near the, such and such corner store.
Yeah,
And 20 years later, your kids have no idea because that store's not there anymore.
that's right.
So here's the other part that I think is really important. It doesn't just mean that Luke was accurate. It means he was there, because some people want to say, okay, well, this is written in the hundreds or 200, but they wouldn't have called those things that same name back or that much later. So it doesn't just mean that Paul or Luke was there. It means, or that he's accurate. It means that he was there at the right time in history.
That's
so
right.
now we can actually pinpoint when these books are written more specifically, which even is more confirmation.
That's right. And that gets into something, Alex, that I like to talk about at Epic Archaeology. And it's something that is really fundamental to any discussion about archaeology in the Bible. And that is something that historians call primary sources. And a primary source is how do we get at knowledge of the past? And as historians, archaeologists are a version of a historian, except we study history from artifacts, whereas historians, technically speaking, historians study history from primarily text. But it's the relationship between the three primary sources that's in discussion here, and that is we have eyewitnesses, or we have people who claim to be eyewitnesses. Then we have historical records, which are the gospel accounts, again claiming to be historical records, and then we have the archaeological evidence. So we can have anybody can say anything, but we can. If we go there and actually dig and we find it, that means that this person writing about this knew exactly what they're talking about. They must have been there, and they must have been present when they wrote about these things. One example I gave was in my own history. My grandfather was an eyewitness to D-Day, and now he's deceased, but he left when he passed away. My grandmother gave me some of his books and some of his pictures, and in the books he actually records when he was there in Normandy, June 6, 1944. And you can actually go, so we have a historical source, and you can actually go to Normandy today to actually find that there's archaeological evidence of a great battle that took place there over 70 years ago. So here's an instance in which we have eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeology coinciding perfectly together. And in the New Testament, it's exactly the same way.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think, I talk with Jim Warner Wallace a lot, and he talks about the cumulative case. And I have another friend who's a detective, and
Yep.
when you're building a case, it's rarely ever like you catch the person at the scene who just did it. You got this piece of evidence and this piece, and you take all those and put them together, and then you have to say, if you're going to be honest with the situation from an abductive approach, like what is we're reasoning to the best inference, or the best most likely reason for this evidence, what best explains it. And I think it's very difficult if people are going to be honest with the situation and not come with presuppositions to say, well, when you put those three factors together and they all point to the same thing, and there's clearly not even a potential for collusion because this is so long ago and they weren't even necessarily known of each other or knew who was going to write what or who was going to bury what where. It's not a logical conclusion. And so I think, with the classical approach, like as you mentioned in the beginning, it's hard, like I said, to ignore that quantity of confirmation.
That's right. And you're right, Alex, in pointing out the cumulative case for archaeology. There are two kinds of people when we're out there discussing Christian evidences, and some people want absolute certainty. They want all the T's to be crossed, all the I's dotted. But let me just say, in archaeology, we rarely, if ever, have that. It's a cumulative case, but it's a very strong case, and it is beyond reasonable doubt. So you can actually make a very strong case for Christianity based on the historical accuracy of Christ now, and the historical accuracy of the Gospels. But that's not the only thing, because we also have arguments for God's existence, which has to be true in order for resurrections to happen. Everybody has a worldview, and you can make a strong historical case, but if there's not an actual God to do a miracle, then your historical arguments really fall on deaf ears, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's hard. If God doesn't exist, this whole thing falls apart. Right?
Exactly. Yes.
So I want to move to what is arguably one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes.
I believe in 1947. And so if you can just talk briefly about What are the Dead Sea Scrolls for those that don't know, and why was this such an important archaeological discovery?
Yes, so the Dead Sea Scrolls, as you correctly pointed out, were discovered in 1947, and it's interesting that you bring this up because it touches on something very important in archaeology. And I want to throw a big word out there. It's a French word, but it's I like the word, and I like using it because it explains a lot. Um, the English version of this word would be context. So any if you're reading a text, you want to look at words or sentences in their context. Well, artifacts are the same way. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first came to light, they came to light as they were taken out of their archaeological context. So in 1947, there was a Bedouin named Muhammad El Deeb who was with his uncle, I think it was, and they were there in the Dead Sea area around a site we now know as Qumran, Wadi Qumran, there on the shore of the Dead Sea, which is just south of Jerusalem, several miles. And so the story goes, he was looking for a lost sheep or a goat. He threw a stone up into a cave. He heard some pottery kind of break. He climbed up there and discovered these jars, and inside the jars were these rolled up scrolls. Yeah. So he took some of them out, and they ended up on the market in Amman, Jordan. And there was a guy by the name of Sukenik who actually recognized the value of the scrolls. Again, they're taken out of their context. Yeah. So it wasn't until a year or so later until the archaeologist actually went down into the Dead Sea and looked at other caves and discovered this entire hoard of scrolls that date back to the Second Temple period in Israel. This is the period. So the Second Temple period spans a time from about 500 BC all the way to about 70 AD. Yeah. So it's a fairly broad range. So the scrolls, they date range from that time period. But one of the most significant things that was discovered within the Dead Sea Scrolls was the complete Isaiah scroll. So they found the complete book of Isaiah, and it was 99.99% exactly what we have today in our book of Isaiah, which means that now the date of this Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls was about the 1st or 2nd century BC. So we're talking a couple of hundred years before Jesus was born. Yeah. Now that's significant. I mean, even if you take a liberal view of the Bible, I mean, Isaiah 53 is an obvious prophecy about the coming of Jesus and him dying a cruel death. You know, it talks about the suffering servant. So even at minimum, you've got a amazing a scroll of prophecy that predicts Jesus dying on the cross there in about 30 BC or so, or 30 AD.
You know, that's actually my favorite thing to talk about when I do the workshops, and I have it on the screen. I said 99.5. I guess I can go out. But I use the specific example of Isaiah 53 because I think in there that I was researching, there are 17 letters different. Nothing 10 or like 3 are conjunctions, 7 were typos, like or not even typos, like you spell color COLOR,
errors or whatever. Yeah,
or you can spell color COLOUR. It doesn't change the meaning of anything.
That's right.
And I told somebody, I was like, if I didn't tell you this was Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is so specifically messianic that it could literally fit in the New Testament and you wouldn't even think twice about it. And there's no way you can read Isaiah 53 and think anything other than that. So I think there was 3 copies of Isaiah prior to that, 3 manuscripts, or at least 3. So we were hoping that was accurate, I guess. It's been, in Bibles for years at that point, centuries at that point. But like you said, to find a complete scroll, that was 2,000 years later, is amazing. Right. It's amazing.
That's right. And I had just recently on my own podcast at Epic Archaeology, I had New Testament scholar Craig Evans on.
Oh, cool.
And Craig is he is a textual scholar, and I asked him about some of the Gnostic texts like Nag Hammadi and some of the other Gnostic texts, and I said, what about, are there any new things? He said, Ted, he said, there are so many texts, there's no telling what we have. We have so many texts coming on the horizon and that we don't know about. So there could be new discoveries that we could find in the next 10, 15 years that could maybe even surpass the Dead Sea Scrolls. But so far, nothing yet.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. I think there was close to 2,000, partial or complete manuscripts That's a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
For somebody.
And then I asked him about it. There's a site in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Mhm.
So Oxyrhynchus is it's sort of a backwater in ancient Egypt, and there was this horde of papyrus manuscripts that was discovered by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, and many of them were ancient biblical manuscripts. So we're
Wow.
talking about the 2nd century AD, and what we're talking about here is Craig Evans again, he said that Oxyrhynchus was sort of like the Bakersville, California of ancient Egypt. So he said, what goes on in Bakersville? No offense to anybody from Bakersville, but the point is that it's kind of a backwater. So why would you have these manuscripts? He said the importance of that is that if there were that many manuscripts that were thrown away in Oxyrhynchus, imagine the amount and the quality of manuscripts that were in a city like Alexandria or in Athens or in Jerusalem. There's no telling what's out there. And so there are monasteries today and libraries today around the world that could have manuscripts that we're not even aware of.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's amazing. One of the greatest evidences for the Bible is just once again, take all presuppositions away, just from a historical investigative perspective. Historians, I think Mike Licona talks about how a historian is having the time of their life if they have 2 primary source documents to support an event. And obviously, the way papyrus works, you had to recopy because it doesn't survive like our paper of today.
Yep.
For anyone that was wondering. But like you said, to have that quantity of manuscripts to far exceed not just any other religious document or set of documents, far exceed any other historical ancient text or ancient writings of any kind. So we have to ask at least the question, why did they feel the need to preserve this and copy it to this degree across 3 continents and in multiple countries and languages? And then how amazing is it that it's so accurate? When we look at 10,000 copies of the Book of John, or whatever you're looking at, and there's a typo here or there, a write-o, I don't know what you call it, a scribal error, but that's the benefit of having so many manuscripts, because you can see where the error is. And so I think people try to make, the Bart Ehrmans of the world try to make that into a negative, but it's actually a positive.
That's right.
So I think that's really, really interesting. I'm excited to see what else gets discovered.
Absolutely.
I want to ask, so that was the greatest discovery of the 20th century, I think.
Yes.
What is the greatest archaeological discovery since the Dead Sea Scrolls?
That's a great question. And so, if you ask that question let me just say this, that if you have 2 archaeologists in a room, you have about 3 or 4 or 5 opinions between the 2. But I probably would have answered that question differently several years ago. But in the past 3 or 4 years, and it just was confirmed to me by an archaeologist that I interviewed, Jody Magnus, who is a professor of archaeology at UNC Chapel Hill. And she actually was the co-director of Masada near Qumran in Israel back several years ago. And she actually has an article on this. And when she said this, I was like blown away, because it's exactly what I thought. I never had really said anything about it. But in 2007, let me just back up and say, because the question is that what will be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries since the Dead Sea Scrolls? Yeah. And when Jody answered the question, well, I didn't ask her that question, but when she gave me her thoughts on this discovery, and she gave why it wasn't popular, then the light bulb came on. And I thought that's it. So I'm going to tell you what she said and what I also think as well, and that is that it was the discovery that many Christians are not aware of this, and maybe some of them are, but this is a major discovery. Okay. We have actually discovered, not we, but collectively, but an archaeologist in 2007, an Israeli archaeologist by the name of Ehud Netzer, discovered the sarcophagus of Herod the Great. Wow. We've got the sarcophagus of Herod the Great. So that would be number 1. And then number 2, I would say we also have the ossuary of Caiaphas. He was the high priest that presided over the trial of Christ. So we too have 2 major figures from the New Testament where we have direct archaeological evidence. And now, again, there are always naysayers. There are people who say, well, we're not sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, there's always a level of, ambiguity there. But when you start to do the math and you start to look at the statistics of statistical analysis and who these people could be, there's nobody else it could be. And so I would say the discovery of the tomb of Herod the Great. He was buried at a site called Herodium, which he named in honor of himself.
Yeah.
And by the way, the site of Herodium overlooks the site of Bethlehem, so where Jesus was born. So when we read in the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 2, and the Christmas story about Herod, hearing the Magi come, and very likely the edict to kill the firstborn came from Herodium, and that's where Herod was buried. He actually died at his winter palace at Jericho, and there was a very huge procession of professional mourners. In fact, Herod, according to Josephus, Herod basically was going to have a lot of people killed upon his death, so that because he knew he was hated by the Jews, and so he wanted to make sure people were going to cry at his funeral. So he passed this law. Isn't this crazy? He passed a law so that these people would be killed, so that they'd be crying when he died. But they were, thank goodness, they were ignored. Nobody believed him, or nobody followed the orders out. And so, but he did, the procession did come into Herodium, and it was searched for years. And Ehud Netzer, in a kind of a weird twist of irony, he did discover the sarcophagus. It was in a little side area. Now, Herodium is a man-made, it looks like a volcano, but it's actually a fortress inside of it. And so there was this little mausoleum that was built on the side of the mountain, and that's where Herod's sarcophagus was discovered. A few years later, very sadly, Ehud Netzer actually died at Herodium. I think he slipped. There are some really tall areas there, and sadly passed away. So a little interesting twist of irony there, that he died at the very place where he spent most of his life to study.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff.
That is really interesting. Wow.
Yeah. Well, did you know? Let me ask you this: did you know that we actually had the sarcophagus of Herod the Great?
I did not.
Yeah, we do.
I'm going to include it from now on, though.
Yeah, you should. And Jody Magnus actually, in her article, she actually says, and I'm actually in the process right now of turning her article into an Epic Archaeology article. I'm going to basically kind of sort of translate what she says, because I agree with everything she said. She says in her article, she believes that Herod believed that he was the fulfillment of the Messiah. That he himself, Herod the Great, believed he was the fulfillment of Isaiah 53. Can you believe that? Isn't that crazy? But it makes sense, and I think she's right. I mean, I don't agree that Herod was, but he thought that he was. He thought that he was the fulfillment of the Jewish Messiah.
Wow, it is amazing. Like I said, archaeology will tell on you in ways that historians that write stuff down, that's one thing, but once again, that tangible evidence that somebody can see, touch, and feel.
Yep.
It tells its own story, and you can't, you're not here to rewrite that story.
That's right. Yeah.
So,
speaking of, if we have time, I can share. I actually have an artifact that is. Maybe we'll get to this. I don't know if we'll have time, but when we get a second, I do have an amazing artifact to show the listeners and the viewers direct evidence for the reliability of the Old Testament.
Yes, we will definitely get to that. And actually, we're going to shift to kind of Old Testament now. But the first thing I want to ask you is, and you kind of touched on this, but some have denied, obviously, that people such as King David, and let's just say King David specifically, lived. What evidence is there for his existence and his reign? And actually, as we get into that, there's a great book here by Kitchen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this is,
Kenneth Kitchen, he's an Egyptologist, yes.
Yeah, and there's 150 pages just footnotes and maps and references at the end of the book. So it's one of the most well-researched books I ever read. But there's one quote, he says, in this light, much can be said, a little on Saul's time, more on David's, and much more on Solomon's epic. David's empire, inherited by Solomon, belongs to a particular type of mini empire of a scope and nature only present and feasible within the interval between about 1180 BC and 870 BC, and at no other time in the first millennium, being known also from Neo-Hittite and Armenian analogs. Now, that's not just trying to make the Bible fit. That's that, even though that is the time where David's regime would be placed. I believe probably 900 is a better time zone, but it's in that window. So the scriptures repeatedly, as you're showing, get affirmed, and the biblical writers would not have known how to make this up. I think that one of the things that I always try to stress to people is some things are unfakeable. Like in a day and age of today, where we have technology and we have at least the potential for conspiracies legitimately, where you can fake stuff and do cyber, and you can tweak stuff, and they didn't have that feasibility. Even if they were thinking on that level, but then you have to show another thing that they would be thinking on that level. Why deceive if they're just recording history? That's a whole other story. But can you give us just more evidence or something else that you think about when you think about King David, his empire, and even from Saul to David to Solomon, and then going forward, like the evidence that has been discovered in support of that?
Sure, absolutely. So when we get to the Old Testament, something that is critically important is something called chronology. And so to paraphrase the title of a book by Bill Deaver, what did the biblical writers know and when did they know it? That's the key question. What did they know and when did they know it? Are they writing about events that happened years ago and made it up, or were they eyewitnesses of the events? Those kinds of questions. So one of the things that you're sort of alluding to, Alex, is the skepticism that many scholars have on the Davidic kingdom. And so the date that you gave with Kenneth Kitchen is about right. I mean, he gives a very broad range, but most scholars place David's reign in the 9th and 10th century BC. So we're talking about 1000 to 900 BC. Right. And also what we'll say as well is that one of the things that I learned from an archaeologist that I've worked with in Israel, and I've followed his work for years, Dr. Bryant Wood, and I'm an associate with ABR, and I do archaeological work. I write for them as well. ABR stands for Associates for Biblical Research. And Dr. Bryant Wood, by the way, was the archaeologist who discovered the site of Ai, which we'll talk about maybe here in a minute. But essentially, chronology is important in where we place something. And what I learned from Bryant Wood is that whenever there is a supposed discrepancy between the historical text when we read about in the Bible and the actual archaeology itself, we need to go back and carefully read the text. Yeah. Read the text. So I think a lot of people, when they read about David and Solomon, they think, oh, it's like King Arthur and this great grand empire. And that's just not the case. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible presents David as capturing Jerusalem from the Jebusites. They were one of the smaller tribes among the Canaanites. So we're not talking about this big, giant, vast empire. Yes, it started out small. But what we can glean from the archaeological and historical record was, in fact, that there was a man named David that lived. We found the Tel Dan inscription. Also on the Mesha stele, there's also was the first mention of the name of Yahweh. And then now we know that there's another passage that actually mentions the house of David as well. So that's the second inscription that contains
the name of David. Can you explain what a stele is for everybody else?
Yes, a stele is like it's sort of like a giant tombstone. It looks like a giant tombstone, but it has writing on it, and that would be a stele. And so some of them would be about as tall as your shoulder. Some of them would be as tall as your head, like 6 foot tall or whatever. They're various sizes, but primarily they were like giant bulletin boards, or they would advertise something important like a law code or some kind of government propaganda from the king. And so, yeah, mostly Egyptians or Assyrians or Babylonians. Many people left steles, but yeah, it's like a giant stone with writing on it. Gotcha. So I would say also with David, we know that he lived during the time of the Philistines, and we know about who the Philistines are through the archaeology. And in fact, there are 5 cities called the Philistine Pentapolis that actually has evidence for in the scripture. So these 5 Philistine cities, in fact, one of them is called Ekron, and we've actually found an inscription it's called the Ekron Inscription. And by the way, Ekron is also where Uriah the Hittite was killed in a battle right outside of Ekron. So if you remember the story of David and Bathsheba, her husband Uriah was a Hittite, and David had him placed at the front of the battle. And so we've actually found evidence of Ekron's existence, and we've excavated there. And all the 5 Philistine cities in the plain. Just recently, in the past 5 or 6 years, archaeologists working in Israel have actually discovered, it's called the City of the Two Gates, I think it is, the Twin Gates. I think that's, I'm just going off the top of my head. But essentially, it's in the episode where David fights Goliath on the plain of Elah. So basically, there's this valley, and there's a city close to a Philistine city close to the valley of Elah. And so the Israelites were on one side, the Philistines were on the other side, and there was a city, and they've discovered that city. And the twin gates are there exactly as they are mentioned in the text. So we've got a very, very good evidence for this event in the historical record. And again, it's not mentioning David by name, but what I would say is the historical context is very affirming of what we read about David. And then later in Solomon's reign, we have really strong evidence that Solomon, of course, the Bible does tell us that Solomon, going against God, he multiplied wives, and he also reinforced the cities. And some of the cities that he reinforced, we've actually discovered archaeological evidence of those reinforcements. One is called Lachish, which is it's about 9 miles north of Jerusalem. It guards the gate, or guards the main road if you were an invading army coming in from the north. So you wanted to have the city fortified. So Solomon fortified it, which means he broadened the walls. He made it more militarily, strong. And then also the city of Megiddo, which archaeologists have excavated for years. So yeah, sorry, my text is going off. I'm trying to get it out of the way there. But in any case, so the Davidic Solomonic era is known about. And then one other thing that I'll mention to you, Alex, as well, concerning David is an Israeli archaeologist by the name of Eliot Mazar has been excavating in Jerusalem, there near the city of David, and she has discovered what she believes is perhaps maybe even David and Solomon's palace there in Jerusalem that dates to the 10th century BC.
Wow.
By the way, in as a side note, in her excavations, years later, after David and Solomon, one of their great-great-great-grandsons, a king by the name of Hezekiah, 2 of his seals were discovered. And then a year or so later, a Hezekiah seal, which means it was basically a clay seal, little small clay seal that had the signet ring of the king pressed into the clay that sealed the document. These little seals are called bulla, was discovered. There was a Hezekiah seal next to an Isaiah seal. So not only you got Hezekiah and Isaiah, the seals sitting 3 centimeters apart in a level in Jerusalem that dates back to the 8th century BC.
Wow.
So yeah,
this is pretty incredible, and I just pray that anyone who's listening, or anyone who's going to watch this later, regardless of your current perspective regarding the Bible, just at least take consideration of these facts that many discoveries, as we've said, have been made by atheistic archaeologists, and regardless of who it's made by, when things are in proper locations as they're predicted or written about in the scripture, and when they're so confirming of people, places, and events, it's hard to get around that. So just take that and add it to your collective accumulation of evidence. With that being said, one of the big contentions, and actually I don't think I realized until I was taking Apologetics of Old Testament course earlier this year, and I didn't really even realize the contention that people have regarding the Exodus itself, that some even say it didn't happen. And I never even considered that as a possibility. I know the battles that I tend to fight where people want to contend on certain things, but I always thought that was a foregone conclusion. So regarding the Exodus, what evidence is there of this mass of Israelites, or soon to be Israelites, coming out of Egypt and going into what would eventually be Canaan? I read a lot about this, and there's a lot of evidence, it seems to me, that there was, because some will say, well, we can't distinguish between the Hebrews and the Canaanites because they lived the same way. But then when you really dig a little deeper, there were certain differences in the way they gathered, or in the way they maybe built their structures, or in the way they worshipped or did different things. So you can see distinctives where it's almost like if a group of people from another country moves into your neighborhood, you're going to notice certain distinctives, not better or worse, just you're going to notice certain differences, right? And so long way to say, what evidence is there for the Exodus itself, that these Hebrews coming out of Egypt going into Canaan?
Wow. So yeah, that is a great question. And let me just say that we have got even better than some of the things that you have laid out. We've got better than that, which I'll come to in a moment. We've got some truly amazing evidence archaeologically for the Exodus, and it's getting out there, and but more and more Christians are not really they're not really seeing the big picture, and that's what I've been trying to do in my talks. I do a lot of talks on the Exodus, and I've studied this for goodness, probably 20 years. And this is one of the subjects that's near and dear to my heart. So let me say a quick word very quickly, Alex, about the importance of the Exodus. We can't just throw away the Exodus, not just like one of these things. Oh, well, what do you think about the Exodus? Well, I think this and I think that. No,
Right.
this is the salvation event in the Old Testament. This is the thing that everybody looks back to. In fact, when Jesus died on the cross, he died on Passover. He was the fulfillment of the Exodus. So if the Exodus didn't happen, then Jesus is a fraud. And everything Jesus said, in fact, all of the early apostles, all the early New Testament writers, when they quote scripture, they're not quoting the New Testament. They're quoting the Old Testament. They're quoting Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Jesus, when he's out in the wilderness, tempted by Satan, he quotes Deuteronomy all 3 times when the Israelites were in the wilderness. So
I think he quoted more from Deuteronomy than any other book, right?
Absolutely. So the Exodus is not a throwaway event from an apologetic standpoint. It is critically important. I would say it this way, Alex, that we apologists spend a lot of times, rightfully so, defending the New Testament, and that's right. And if you think about the analogy of a tree, you've got the tree is above ground, a big oak tree. You got the leaves out there, but on the bottom is the roots. And the leaves, and all the beautiful things we see above the surface in the New Testament, they would have no life apart from the roots in the Old Testament. And so, if you cut off the roots, then you have no life in the tree. So that's why I think, as an apologist, it's important that we defend the Old Testament, and we defend the historical reliability of the Old Testament, because Jesus said in Luke, I believe it's 16, he says, "If you will not believe Moses and the prophets, you would not believe though one rise from the dead."
Right.
So he places a lot of emphasis on Moses and the prophets. And if we won't believe Moses and the prophets, then we won't believe some of the things that we read about in the New Testament. So with that being said, goodness, where do I begin? It's like Dinesh D'Souza said when he was debating atheists, he says, "I feel like a mosquito in a nudist colony. Where do I begin?" No, I'm just kidding. So let me just say, gosh, there's so much about the Exodus. Let me hit the high points here. Let me hit the greatest hits. Number one, let's just try to summarize the best way I can, the quickest way I can. Number one, the big question is, when did it happen? A debate that Christians, even evangelicals, debate about is over the dating of the Exodus. So there is the early date and the late date. The early date is about 1446 BC. Okay. And I'll give the reasoning behind that. The late date is about 1236 BC. So if you take the late date, then that places the Exodus sometime during the reign of Ramses II, which we know a lot about. He was the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history. He reigned for about 77 years. And so we know a lot about the reign of Ramses II. Okay. But here's the thing, is that if you're going to take the Bible seriously, as James Hoffmeyer points out, the Exodus and conquest stand or fall together. So wherever you plant your flag, whatever date you plant the Exodus date in, you also have to figure in 40 years of wilderness wandering, and then you have to figure in some kind of conquest in Israel at about 40 years after that. So when you start looking at the archaeological evidence for and against the early and the late date, in my view, and I've said this for 20 years, and I can just spend hours talking about this, but in my view, the best evidence for the Exodus lies in the early date. And I'll give you one couple of internal evidences in the biblical text itself, and then we'll get into some of the archaeological evidence. Number one, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says that Solomon laid the foundations of his temple 480 years after the Israelites came after the Exodus. So most scholars, even liberal scholars, would say that Solomon laid the foundations of the temple in Jerusalem at about 966, 967 BC. So when you do the math, you come to a date of 1446. So internally in the text itself, if those dates are correct, 1 Kings 6:1 is narrative. There doesn't seem to be any poetic imagery there. So it seems like you should just take that literally, that 480 years.
Right.
It's not a round number, it's the accurate number. And then also in Leviticus talks about the Jubilee cycles that happened every 7 years. So when you count the Jubilee cycles as they were counted after the wilderness, then the Jubilee cycles also match what we see of an Exodus 1446 date. So
okay,
then
1446 or 12?
1446.
Okay,
yeah, so that's the early date. That's
early
right.
date. Okay.
So then the question then becomes, well, who was reigning at 1446? And this is where you get into a question of Egyptian history. So there is a high chronology and a low chronology of Egyptian kings and pharaohs. And the view that I take is that when you adjust for chronology, and I think there's good scholarly reasons for doing this, this places the Exodus, 1446 Exodus date, in the middle of the 18th dynasty of Egypt during the reign of a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep II. Now, his father was a pharaoh by the name of Tutmosis III. His stepmother was a queen pharaoh by the name of Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut is one of the most well-known women from the ancient world. I would say, aside from Cleopatra, the Greek/Egyptian princess that ruled Egypt during the first century, Hatshepsut is probably one of the greatest Egyptian queens that ever lived. And Alex, this is interesting. This is not just my own view, but one of my scholars that I follow, Dr. Eugene Merrill, in his book, Kingdom of Priests, according to this chronology, if we are right about the chronology, it is very likely that Hatshepsut, when she was a teenage girl, pulled Moses from the Nile. Moses would have grown up in the Pharaoh's household and would have known Tutmosis III. So when Moses murders an Egyptian, he flees to Midian for 40 years, and he comes back. Then Tutmosis III is dead, and his son Amenhotep II is reigning. And so when we look at that time period in Egyptian history, there is a site in Egypt called Tel El Daba, and it is in the Nile Delta. So you got the Nile that flows from the south to the north, and it empties out into the Mediterranean in the Nile Delta. Now, on the eastern branch of the Nile Delta, the site called Tel El Daba is the ancient site is called Avaris. And this is where we actually see a very large Semite population. These, we believe, are Hebrews. And they show up during the time of Joseph and Jacob. Jacob would have, again, according to the chronology that I'm following, Joseph and Jacob would have entered Egypt at about 1876 BC. So they're there in Egypt for 430 years, exactly as the Bible says. So later in the reign of, I believe it's Amenemhat III. I'm not exactly sure which pharaoh, but basically it was the pharaoh when Joseph was alive. There were 11 tombs found at Avaris, with one large tomb shaped like a pyramid that had a statue of a guy with a coat of many colors. And this statue was basically destroyed. Somebody chiseled the face off. Now, who would have wanted to chisel the face off? Well, it would have been angry Egyptians, because these Semite Hebrews left Egypt under Moses. But there's so much more. And I'm going to end with this. And this is a slightly controversial. When I say controversial, I'll use that in quotation marks. The reason why I say it's controversial is that scholars have not accepted it yet because it's so new. So one of my colleagues at ABR, Doug Petrovich, who's an Egyptologist, and he's really more of a paleographer. Well, he studied these inscriptions found in the Sinai Peninsula. So basically, you've got Egypt, and separating Egypt from Israel is that large little triangular piece of land called the Sinai Peninsula. Well, down in the Sinai Peninsula, there were these turquoise mines. And there were people that were Egyptian slaves, I guess you would. They were actually mining turquoise for the Egyptians. Well, there are these stelae, we talked about stelae before, that actually contain this very ancient writing called the Proto-Sinaitic Inscriptions. And nobody really knows what this language was. So it's a combination of Hebrew and Egyptian. And we know, according to Doug, again, I'm not a paleographer. I've read his stuff. I've interviewed him. According to Doug, most scholars know that this language on these inscriptions are actually Semitic, which means they could be Jewish, they could be Akkadian, they could be any number of languages, but no one's really broken the code of these Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions. So what he proposed in his book called The World's First Alphabet is that Joseph, get this, when he was in charge, he put his brother Manasseh and his because his brothers came into Egypt, put them in charge of the turquoise mines. And every year they would go down, they would make these inscriptions. And Joseph very likely created this language that was part hieroglyphics and part Hebrew. And it was the Proto-Hebrew language. Now, here's the cool thing about this. This is amazing. So he has, based on this decipherment and based on this work he's done, he has deciphered some of these inscriptions. And guess what, Alex? He has found the name of Manasseh. He has also found the name of Moses in these inscriptions. In fact, this is really cool. Guess which year the last inscription shows up? 1446 BC. Isn't that crazy? And this is what the inscription says. It says, I'm going to paraphrase it, and I can send you a picture for the listeners who want to see this. If they want to see this inscription, it says, "Our bound servitude had lingered. Moses then came and provoked astonishment." So, in other words, they're basically saying we were enslaved for a long time, and then Moses came and he did all these great stuff, and now we're out. Now, here's the cool thing: that language disappears out of the Sinai Peninsula in 1446, and then it shows up in Israel. And this is where scholars get confused, and it looks like Ugaritic. So, most scholars believe that Paleo-Hebrew comes from Ugaritic. But what happened is that after the 40-year wilderness wandering, the conquest happens in 1406 BC. And so that language then migrates up into Israel. And not only that, but the site of Avaris, guess what, Alex? It goes blank archaeologically in 1446 BC. Isn't that cool? I'm just telling you that there's so much. I could just talk about this for days, but that's just a scratching the tip of the iceberg, to use a mixed metaphor.
I mean, that is a lot. And I know it's exciting when you can see everything, kind of the stars aligning, especially when we were reading the Bible and it's written so long ago, especially the Pentateuch. And then you see all this archaeological evidence kind of affirm everything that's in there.
That's right.
Go ahead.
In Petrovich's further work, he's done some work on Amenhotep II, and it seems like in the 9th year of his reign, now his father, Tutmosis III, was considered to be the Napoleon of Egypt. He does 17 military campaigns into the Levant. This is the area in Israel and Lebanon and Syria. So when he dies, his son, Amenhotep II, who's the Exodus Pharaoh, he does several, maybe half a dozen, 5 or 6 campaigns. And then in the 9th year of his reign, his military essentially goes missing, and he does no more military campaigns. Now, this is at the height of Egyptian power. The only two superpowers at the time were the Hittites, a group called the Mitanni, and the Egyptians. And this is the height of when Egypt was at its height in military power. So there's no reason why, unless the military was defeated in the bottom of the Red Sea, why this whole thing would disappear. But it makes sense. It actually fits what we read in the biblical record.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, from the Exodus, then, they have to come eventually into the Promised Land, and so then we have to look at the eventual conquest of Joshua. And so, as you said, you kind of worked backwards from 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, and getting to the date of the most likely date, which I agree with you, for the Exodus itself. But then as they're coming into the Promised Land, and here's one thing I need to reinforce to everybody, because we tend to think, like you said very, very clearly, you got to go back to the scriptures and read what they actually said, because we tend to think, okay, they went to the Promised Land, they conquered everybody in a few weeks, and then that was that. And that's not what scripture says. Nor does it say complete annihilation. That we have to be clear on that too. And when you talk about, and I know you'll bring up the city of Ai, because some people, especially skeptical scholars, will say, well, God's wrong. He's a moral monster for killing everybody. Well, in that's ancient Near East hyperbole. And so you see the next chapter, and I think Joshua 7, it talks about don't intermarry with them. Well, if everybody's dead, who are you going to intermarry with? So clearly that was not the case. And also Ai and Jericho, or Ai and there's other cities there.
Let me correct you, because I was corrected in my pronunciation. It's pronounced I.
Oh, I. Okay.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I said the same thing, man. Don't worry, because when I was in Israel, I was actually excavating there, and my archaeology friend said, "Ted, it's not AI, it's I." So I'm like, "Okay, I got it."
Well, I'd rather make a mistake here.
No, it's all
So
good, man.
it was a military stronghold though, so it wasn't
Yes,
just random village town. So once again, everybody, the Israelites weren't marching in just killing random people. This was a military stronghold. Also, there was not a there was Canaanites who became part of the Hebrew culture. They were able to kind of live amongst them, and as long as that happened, there was no reason for any kind of war or violence. So anyway, that's a side note, but we do need to talk about the conquest of Joshua and what
yes,
evidence you have of that. And I believe you have, is this the one you have, like the actual artifact of something to show?
yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do. So basically, let me just piggyback on something you were just saying just a second ago, and that is that when you carefully read the text, the Bible the book of Joshua, which is the beginning of the historical books, because we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua begins where the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the Law, we call the Law, the first 5 books, they really set the stage for the rest of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And I've taught Old Testament for years. And one of the things I've always told my students is if you really want to understand the New Testament, you have to understand the Old Testament. But if you want to understand the entire Old Testament, just understand the first 5 books. Everything that's taught in the first 5 books is just outplayed in the rest of the historical books and the prophets and all the other books. So, so whereas all these things are talked about in the first 5 books, they're actually brought to fruition in the book of Joshua. So Joshua begins the conquest, but the scripture, if you read it very carefully, there are only 3 cities that states were burned, and there were Jericho, a city called Ai. Some people call it AI, and I did as well. But I'm told by the scholars and the archaeologists, it's pronounced I.
I take your word.
So there's Jericho, Ai, and a city called Hatzor. Hazor. You put a little T in it because it's Hebrew words, Hatzor. So it's Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. And let's go back to the date. Again, if the date is the early date, or let me just back up. Let's say if the date is the late date. Let's say if we want to plan our flight, say, no, I believe the Exodus happened in 1236, whatever. I believe it was Ramses II. Here's what I'd say. Okay, fine. That's great. Well, then you have no conquest. You essentially have no archaeological evidence for the conquest. Well, maybe you've saved the Exodus, which I don't think you have, because I don't think there's good evidence that Ramses II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. There's no evidence whatsoever that his reign was diminished in any way by any Hebrew slave force in any way, shape, or form. And then also, there's no conquest. We know the cities. We know where Jericho is. We know where Ai is. And the city of Hatzor has been excavated for several decades. So essentially, you have no conquest. And I say, that's great. You have no conquest. Now you have no Exodus. But when you plug in the early date, not only do you have really good evidence for an Exodus, we also have good evidence for a conquest. And now here's where again, a little controversy comes in, but I think that a very strong case can be made academically that the interpretation of what's been discovered in Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor actually comport with the historical record and with the archaeological record, the biblical record, and very fine detail. With Jericho, it was excavated back in the 1930s by the University of Chicago, led under the direction of a British archaeologist by the name of John Garstang. And before that, there were German scholars, 2 scholars by the name of Selin and Watzinger, and they discovered that Jericho actually contained a double casemate wall. And a casemate wall basically is a wall that has rooms inside of so there's a wall, outer wall, and then a room, and then an inner wall. You could put grain, or you could put rocks, or you could live in the wall, which actually matches what we read. City 4 of Jericho had a casemate wall. Now, what do we know of Jericho and how the Israelites actually got into the city? Well, as Rahab, a prostitute living on the wall. And we actually have archaeological evidence of dwelling places along the wall in City 4 of Jericho. So not only that, but then in the 1930s, Garstang came along, and in City 4, he discovered that the entire city was burned and completely left in ruin in City 4. And about 20 years or so later, Kathleen Kenyon, another British archaeologist, came along, and she redates City 4 to a couple hundred years later, and said that the destruction was by the Egyptians. There's multiple problems with that I don't have time to get into, but essentially it comes down to a couple of things. Number one, chronology, which is what is at the heart of the debate, the timing of the day of the event, and then also the interpretation of the pottery, of the ceramics. Pottery is everything in archaeology, and pottery styles change over time. So in the 1406 BC, this is during a period called the Late Bronze Age. And in the Late Bronze Age in Israel, there was a certain kind of pottery that when you find this pottery at a layer, you know it's going to date that layer to a particular time frame. And the pottery is called Cypriot bichrome pottery. It's a big word. It just simply means the pottery came either from Cyprus. If it was imported pottery, it means that it was by a wealthy person and it dates to a particular time. But if it was locally made Cypriot pottery, it's going to date to the Late Bronze Age. So when Kathleen Kenyon excavated, she excavated in a very wealthy quarter of Jericho, based on some of the discoveries there, and she didn't find any locally made Cypriot pottery, so she redates the site. But it's found in proliferation in the poorer quarters. So according to Bryant Wood, why did she leave out the omission of the previous report? Well, because the previous report actually coincides with the Bible. And so again, I don't know her mind or her heart or why she did this. But to this very day, Alex, that is why liberal scholars will say there's no evidence for the conquest, because they're following Kathleen Kenyon. But one other quick thing about this, and that is in City 4, here's what's interesting about the destruction layer at City 4. There was a double wall, was a very, very well fortified. In fact, when you read the biblical account in Joshua, it says that it was very well fortified, and it was. We see that there was an outer wall, and there was a revetment wall, and then there was an inner wall, a whole inner fortress as well. But here's the interesting thing about that. In City 4, the wall, do you know where the wall fell? It didn't fall. So if you were an army and you were going to punch through a wall, where would you expect to find the bricks? Inside the city, right? Well, the bricks are not found inside the city. The bricks are actually form a ramp right up into the city. In fact, the biblical text actually says that when you march around the city 7 times and you give a real loud shout, the walls of the city, the Hebrew text says, they will fall beneath themselves and everyone will go up straight into the city. Well, that's exactly what we find at Jericho. The walls falling beneath themselves, forming a ramp right into the city, and the city's burned. Nothing is taken. It was taken. In fact, when Garstang discovered these large amphora pots and jars, they were full of charred grain, which means, and also supports the biblical record, that the conquest took place in the harvest time of the year when all the harvest was being taken in. So why, if the Egyptians conquered City 4 of Jericho, then why didn't they take all the stuff? Well, it doesn't make sense. You would take that stuff. Well, the Bible does give us another reason why Joshua did not take everything in it. He said, you were to offer it as a burnt offering to me. And this was from the book of Leviticus. This was a first fruit offering that God says, listen, just like when you gave the first fruit offering from your crops as a recognition that I am the one who gave the rain and the soil and the sun, you were recognizing that I am the one that gave you victory over this site. And so it's exactly what we find in the archaeological record. So that's Jericho. and I is, and I'll go real quick here. Back in 2014, I was assistant square supervisor at along the late Bronze Age Canaanite fortress. And it was burned exactly like, it was a smaller fortress. And geographically, it fits everything we read about in the Old Testament. And I didn't find this particular piece, but one of my colleagues did. And this is found in the city during the late Bronze Age. I'm going to hold it up to the camera here. But again, when you read the biblical account that the Israelites burned the city, well, how do we know it's burned? Because there is an ash layer. And when you find an ash layer in the late Bronze Age, they're in the 1406, 1401 time frame. You see that black stuff right there under the rim?
Yeah.
That is charring from the burning of right there.
Wow.
And this is a late Bronze Age piece of pottery from directly confirming what the biblical record actually says. And that's just one of thousands.
Man, this is I'm learning so much. I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch this myself. We could go on forever, I'm sure. But I want to just ask one more question.
Sure.
And maybe we'll have to do a part 2. I don't know.
Yeah, let's do it.
So this is semi-related to the previous question, and you kind of did touch on this because I kind of, had heard and read obviously in the Bible about Hazor or Hatzor,
Hatzor, yeah.
Hatzor, but then I was reading a lot about the controversy with that particular city as well, and you brought it up. So we'll end on this, that there have been some questions raised about that particular city. So what have archaeologists discovered about the biblical city of Hatzor? And it's actually, I believe, one of the sites of one of the more remarkable victories that Israel or that the Hebrews had. So, what can you tell us about that particular city? That I believe you said was another one of the fortresses, right?
Right. So, so during this time, during the late Bronze Age, this was a time of international trade, and you got to remember the Canaanites. Whenever you use that term Canaanite, it is a very broad brush term, and it includes a lot of smaller little groups within Palestine at the time, Israel. What I call it Israel. I don't mean, when I say Palestine, I don't mean the political modern day Palestine. Right. I mean the area of Palestine during the late Bronze Age. So you've got the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Hittites. You have all these groups, and Israel is this corridor of trade and commerce between Syria in the north. You also have the Mitanni in the north. You've got the Assyrians. You've got eventually the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So then you got Egypt in the south. And so Israel, along this area, the Canaanite culture, they built fortresses, and they built these little small fortresses to protect their people. Now, people lived outside the fortresses, but when there was an invading army, everybody would sort of leave their house and go inside the fortress and close the door. Yeah. And so at Hatzor is one of those, again, late Bronze Age Canaanite fortresses, and it has been excavated. And there is burn layer exactly where we believe the Exodus took place in the late Bronze Age. The archaeologist who excavated there was a very famous Israeli archaeologist by the name of Yigael Yadin, who excavated Masada. And by the way, he was the one to excavate Masada, discovered the mass Jewish suicide, on the top of Masada. And it was his, I believe, was it his father, Sukenik, was the one to recognize the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were in Jordan and bought the Dead Sea Scrolls. So very interesting little point of irony there. But one of the things also, and I don't know that off the top of my head the exact reference point, but there is a reference in which there was a king who actually built a palace on the ruins of Hatzor, and Yadin discovered, in other words, when they destroyed it, no one had lived there for years. And then he built this one palace, and they found the palace there built on the ruins of Hatzor, exactly as the Bible says. So, I mean, in specific detail, the Bible is correct again and again.
That's a great place to end. I think if there's one way to sum up this discussion, that last sentence that you just said is the way to sum it up. Once again, we started this discussion by talking about how unfakeable and undeniable archaeological evidence is. And so for the skeptic that wants, unless I see, all the papyrus, David signing it, okay, you're never going to get that. But what we can get is enough to build this cumulative case to affirm very important things. Like you said, the Exodus is not this kind of, I feel this way, I feel this way. It's not that type of thing. Even to the point, like Jesus affirmed, like you said, Moses in John chapter 5, the writings of Moses, he said, they speak about me. So if in affirming Moses, he's affirming everything Moses did, and either Jesus is a liar or everything happened. That would be the only way to understand that. In Acts chapter 7, when Stephen's going to be martyred, he gives that brilliant oration of the history of Israel, basically from beginning up to Jesus, and then they kill him. But, I think because he was so accurate, they didn't kill him because he was wrong. They killed him because they didn't like how he ended that talk. But I think the proper thing, I was teaching about hermeneutics earlier this year, and there are certain gaps that we in 21st century Western culture have to traverse. One is a cultural gap, one's a language gap, one's a time gap. We didn't live in an Eastern culture, most of us, and we didn't. The question we have to ask is, what would the audience, the original audience, have heard or read when they heard or read these things? What would they have understood? And start there, and then try to for those things that can be contextualized, because the historical part, I don't think you can contextualize. I don't think you should contextualize. But we have this tendency in Western churches,
Yep.
I'll say, to try to make everything fit us. And
Yep.
that's not accurate. That's not the way to do it. So
Yep.
thank you for taking us back to where things actually happen. Thank you for the work you do. I know you're about to go back over there pretty soon, right?
Yes. I'm really excited. I can't really share details, but I'm really part of an amazing team of international archaeologists that's going to be taking part in a survey in Eastern Turkey, which is an amazing part of the world anyway. I was there last year with some really important meetings to set up this potential expedition. And so perhaps later I can share more about it. But Eastern Turkey is, of course, on the border of Iran, Iraq, and Syria is to the south. So it's, as you can imagine, it's a little dicey when we go there. But we stay pretty safe. But it's funny because I would tell when I first started teaching archaeology, I would tell my students, well, it's nothing like Indiana Jones. And now a few years later, I'm like, some of it kind of actually is.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, definitely be safe. And, once again, the work you do is so important, so vital.
Thank
and
you.
We get to benefit from it. So I pray that you and the team is safe over there. And
thank you. I covet your prayers. Thank you. And those of you who are watching, we appreciate your prayers. Thank you.
Amen. Well, thank you. We're going to go ahead and close out for tonight. We'll when he gets back, maybe we'll get him back on. He can share some more discoveries from him and the team. So Thank you, Ted, and have a blessed night.
Sounds good. God bless.